Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next Survivor Leadership webinar on inclusion, survivor inclusion, and in the workplace. My name is Roxie Farrow, and I'm the program lead of the Survivor Leadership webinar program here at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Before we start, I would like to do a little housekeeping. And first, I would like to talk about Survivor Alliance, which is our partner in this initiative to reach survivors all around the world. Survivor Alliance is a survivor-led organization that assists survivors in thriving in leadership and in the anti-trafficking movement. For more information about Survivor Alliance, we will include a link at the end of the presentation, and it would also be included in the PowerPoint presentation at the end. Also, I would like to make you aware that if you would like to ask a question, there's a question and answer box at the end. At the bottom of your screen, you can click the button and then you can submit your questions. From there, we will answer your question throughout the presentation, and there will also be room or space at the end of the presentation to ask questions if you have them, or even give comments. We will also be recording this webinar. So if you would like not to be recorded, there are no voices of participants, just to protect the confidentiality of all who participates. You can send me a personal email at Roxie, that's ROXIE, at htlegalcenter.org, and we'll also put that in the chat so that you can be sent a copy of today's webinar. So without further delay, let's get started. One second while I share my presentation. Welcome to the presentation on A Survivor's Guide to Survivor Inclusion in the Workplace. Before we start, I just want to give a brief introduction as to why I chose this topic today. There's been a lot of talk in the anti-trafficking community in reference to ways in incorporating survivors within our organizations, within workplaces, and within spaces that would like to engage survivor and survivor-led organizations. The first thing I would like to talk about is defining the term survivor leader. So when we talk about survivor leader, sometimes there's a misconception between how survivors identify themselves versus how workplace or organizations identify survivors. And I think I would like to clear that up to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Survivors identify the way they choose to identify. The term survivor leader indicates that the individual is a primary stakeholder in the anti-trafficking community. Survivor leaders are subject matter experts when it comes to the anti-trafficking community, because of course, they are the ones who have experienced being trafficked. Therefore, they have a lot of valuable insight to include when it comes to being engaged by organizations or working with companies who would like to bring forth the message of the anti-trafficking community. This goes for consulting, this goes for volunteering, and other roles within organizations. When we talk about survivor leaders, there's one thing organizations and service advocates and providers should know. Disclosing whether or not a survivor is a survivor is all about the survivor's choice. You're going to hear me say choice a lot during this presentation because agency and choice is one of the biggest things that survivors require when they are in the workplace. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later within the presentation. So some service providers, advocates, and organizations, when they're initially engaging survivor leaders and they would like to bring them into their workspace, the question always pops up, should we be stating that this person is a survivor? What is the message that we want to put out to our audience regarding our new found survivor and the person that we want to hire or that's consulting with us? And when it comes to disclosure, it can be pretty sticky. If it's done incorrectly, it could potentially damage the working relationship between a survivor and the ones they're working with. So when we're thinking about disclosure, it should be left to the survivor to disclose whether or not they identify as a survivor or a survivor leader. I'll give you an example. Some organizations who hire or who want to hire survivor leaders, they assume that because the survivors participating in the anti-trafficking community world, and they probably have done a couple of trainings and speaking engagements, they automatically assume that the survivor may be comfortable with anyone disclosing their status. However, when we talk about that, it's always important to check in with the survivor, because one day it might be where they do identify as a survivor, and some people don't identify as survivors at all because they do not include their past experience with who they are today in the work that they're doing moving forward, especially within the workspace. Sometimes with that, in disclosing that a survivor is a survivor leader, especially within the workplace, there are other things that come with that. Some of the barriers that survivors have when it comes to disclosing whether or not they're a survivor in the workspace is the following. When a survivor discloses that they're a survivor, there are a lot of assumptions that follow within organizations and workspaces. If a survivor discloses this to their boss may assume that, or their supervisor may assume that, oh, this person may not be able to meet the needs of the organization, or maybe I need to define that person's need. They don't really know what they're doing. You know, they've survived a lot, and so they probably are behind. Or sometimes it can even be a little bit worse than that, where the organization or the service provider or the supervisor may assume that their ability to work or their abilities that come from their own education and their world experience does not match up with the organization's needs. And I think these things can be talked more about during the initial part of onboarding when it comes to engaging in hiring survivors. It's important to consider the survivor's skill set, their professional goals, along with who they are and where they come from. So in the workspace, everybody likes to talk about trauma-informed or being trauma-informed. What does that really mean? When we think about it, there are plenty of guidelines, frameworks, and models that come with instilling the trauma-informed approach within the workspace, especially when it comes or when it relates to survivor inclusion. The number one thing that organizations or workplaces should consider is ensuring that their workspace is, or their environment is safe. Safety is the number one thing. That goes for the survivor's demographic information, anything that they may share with you, so that's confidentiality, safety, and making sure that your infrastructure internally and externally isn't easily infiltrated by traffickers or those who wish to exploit. But most of all, creating a safe space within the organization to ensure that your culture supports survivors and survivor leaders when they are working with you. Trustworthiness and transparency is the second thing that companies should look at or organizations should look at when it comes to establishing a culture that assists within implementing survivor inclusive environments. Some survivors who experience trafficking have difficulty with trusting anybody. Remember, this was an extremely traumatic experience survivors have gone through or have experienced, and every survivor is on a different level of healing. So with that being said, when you're working with survivors, keep that in mind. that a survivor may not trust you off the bat or immediately, but giving the time and the space and the right environment, along with safety and respect, that is something that can be introduced and worked on throughout your working relationship. Peer support is extremely important. Some organizations are built, especially within the anti-trafficking community, to support those who have not experienced trafficking. However, when you engage or would like to onboard a survivor, this is super important. Peer support can not only come from the staff and their peers around them, however, it can also come from survivor-led organizations or different resources that is provided by that organization or workspace. This assists with ensuring that the survivor feels comfortable, that they can talk to or reach out to someone who may understand a little bit more about what they need, and then assist them with communicating their needs with you. Collaboration and mutuality. That is so important. After the first three steps, safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, as well as peer support are established, collaboration and mutuality is the next thing that we would like to look at when it comes to including survivors within your organization. Now, when it comes to collaborations, a lot of organizations think that, hey, we're going to just incorporate the survivor story anytime we want and wherever it meets our needs. And therefore, I'm sure they're going to be okay with it. But pay special attention to how you collaborate with survivors. Ensure that the survivor not only gives you permission to share their story, however, ensure that it is in a safe way and within a safe space. Sometimes, if done incorrectly, this can re-traumatize survivors, and it can bring about a bad work experience. They may not trust, they may not want to work there anymore because they feel like they're being re-exploited again. Lastly, or second to lastly, we want to talk about empowerment, voice, and choice. Like I said, choice and agency is something I'm going to bring up a lot when it comes to working as a survivor, because as a survivor, agency and choice is important. When working, know that sometimes working environments, on a general matter, can mirror the trafficking experience. With that being said, including survivors' voice, asking them the questions, asking them about what they need, listening to their voice, and ensuring that their voice is at the forefront of your narrative will assist in maintaining and sustaining a healthier culture for survivors. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how organizations are engaging survivor leaders and what might be something that will assist when it comes to onboarding practices, as well as cultural change, as well as capacity building. So we talked a little bit about trauma-informed approach, but there are other things that organizations, service providers can think about when they have these discussions in their leadership meeting, when they are thinking about hiring survivors or engaging survivors. One of the things that is very conducive to survivor inclusion or creating a survivor inclusive environment within the workplace is empowerment-based engagement. This not only fosters strengths, but it assists with developing and enhancing leadership skills. Not all survivors will come to an organization or a workspace with all the skills that you need them. And this is not just with with survivors, this is with anybody. So it's good to build in an empowerment-based approach or an engagement so that survivors feel like their needs are being met, but they also understand that you, as a service provider, as someone who is serious about being in the anti-trafficking community, support them. This also includes providing things like additional education resources, connections to other resources that will assist them in moving along in developing additional leadership skills, connecting them to publishers, and etc. Another thing I wanted to bring up was the culture relevant and sensitivity. So we talked about trauma-informed, empowerment-based engagement, and being culturally relevant. I believe that most organizations and workspace strive to do, especially on the back of most recent events earlier this year. You now see a lot of organizations speaking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, that word inclusion includes survivor inclusion as well. Well, what does that mean for organizations who want to engage survivor leaders? That means that it is the organization's duty to stay abreast upon what will keep the leadership as well as their staff informed about what the survivor needs, about the needs of the organizations to support the survivor, and how to continuously build inclusive practices. So sometimes when people are onboarded within organizations or at a job, you get an employee handbook. If that employee handbook hasn't been updated, however, as a service provider or as an organization or as a leader within an organization, you're interested in engaging a survivor, it's best practices to look at your employee handbook and your policies and your procedures to see whether or not they actually match your intentions and whether they're authentic in creating a survivor inclusive environment. It is a delicate balance between meeting your needs of the organization as well as incorporating this new change. And not all organizations do it. So it does take time, and it takes a lot of hard conversations on an internal basis within the leadership team. And it takes a lot of work, both on a personal end and within your organization. These are the things that are needed to create a safe and healthy space for survivors and ensure that survivors are feeling included when they are in your space and they're working. Ethical engagement. It's not much to say here, as you see on the slide. However, being ethical is really important. When we think about the ethical codes and framework, we think about the guiding principles of the organizations. Again, that points back to your strategic planning. It points back to your policies and procedures. It's really important to make sure that those things are aligned and that they not only carry out things like ensuring that there's accountability within the organization, but there's accountability within the organization between staff, between leadership, and it follows through within the organization. It should be consistent because with that consistency, your outcome will be greater when it comes to implementing certain initiatives when it comes to survivor inclusion. Here are some of the ways that you can include survivor leaders in the workplace, or how survivors can be included in the workplace. Like I said before, survivors are more than their stories. You know, we as survivors, we can fit on almost every level of your organization if you just provide the platform and implement a survivor inclusive culture. Survivors survivors aren't mouthpieces. So it's not fair to put survivors on the front lines and say, hey, repeat your story 1,000 times. And that way, that's it. That's all we want to help you with. And then, we look like a survivor inclusive organization because at least we've hired a survivor and you're telling your story. We also want to look at how we can incorporate them on every level. Survivor leaders do a great job in informing their mission, vision, and culture, as I explained before, with the different guiding principles and frameworks. Survivors can also assist organizations in building referral networks and partnerships. So like I said before, when you place survivors in certain roles, whether it be on the bottom line or whether it's in leadership or whether it's on the board, think about the leverage that an organization can use when it comes to, or not use, but an organization is open to, and how it will benefit the organization to implement survivors on different levels. Survivors also can assist organizations or companies with developing fundraising strategies. However, like I said initially, it first takes organizations actively listening to survivors and putting that voice up front so that it's guiding your survivor inclusive environment. Now, we talked about onboarding, we talked about guiding principles, we talked about how organizations can better approach or engage survivors when it comes to the working space and creating a safe space. Now let's talk a little bit about the impact of trauma. We all know that trauma changes the brain, and we all know that trauma, along with human trafficking, is a current public health crisis. So that is something that is to be considered and taken seriously. So, a lot of assumptions that when survivors come into organizations to work, oh, I've heard it all. I've heard so many assumptions about what a survivor should be and what they think they're going to do, or some people walk around eggshells, afraid to ask survivors questions or automatically assume what they need, so therefore they're throwing out all these things that they need. But if a survivor never asked for it or survivor leader never asked for it, you're kind of pushing something on them that they didn't ask for, again infringing upon their autonomy, agency, and choice. So keep that in mind. Not all survivors experience trauma. However, not all of them respond in the way that people assume that they do. Sometimes, there are some issues with flashbacks, re-traumatization, as I said, about the, telling your story over and over again, being guarded or lack of trust, as I mentioned earlier, exhibiting avoidance. So it brings me back to when I was speaking about adding that peer support. It's really good to add mentorship. So if you're hiring a survivor leader, depending on their skill set, depending on where they are placed in the organization and what role they're in, the peer support is something that's so beneficial to both the survivor leader as well as the organization. This puts a survivor in a place where they feel supported, but if they are having a hard time or a hard day, I mean, everybody has a hard day, the more educated an organization is with understanding how trauma affects the brain, and what are some of the responses that might be there or given from survivors, the more prepared you're able to respond and not react to it. I can give you a little bit of an example when it comes to how trauma manifests in the workplace. So, for example, I used to work at Psychiatric Institute of Washington. It's one of the only adult psychiatric inpatient service hospitals here in Washington, D.C. I was there for a little over 8 years as the admissions manager. And as a survivor leader, I came across a lot of trafficking survivors. And so my role there was to assess and then give not a diagnosis, but just a suggestion about the level of care that this person may require. One of the things that I didn't really think about or really consider that I was experiencing is something called vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma it's, how can I explain this? It's like secondhand smoke. So people who smoke, they're in direct contact with smoke. Therefore, they have a higher chance of getting things like cancer or any other health issues. Secondhand smoke, however, can equally affect another person, and they can develop health issues too. So now you see the laws, about secondhand smoke and things like that. Well, it's the same with trauma. As a survivor, I've experienced my own trauma as a labor trafficking survivor. I then worked in a place where I noticed, or I was able to observe a lot of trauma, or just listen or hear some of the stories that people have gone through and the trauma that they've experienced. And while I was dealing with my own trauma, I also had to deal with the vicarious trauma that I was coming into contact with. And because I did not really understand how that was also affecting me, it made me, or it forced me to step back and consider other ways to take care of myself and have self-care. And I say this because as a trafficking survivor, it definitely allowed me and gave me some space to realize that self-care isn't linear. It's something that's happening every day. And therefore, when in the workplace, one of the things that I wish that I had is a peer support person where that I could go and speak to about these things. And then they can educate me more on things like vicarious trauma and how it affects people who've already been through traumatic incidents. Um, I also bring this up because vicarious trauma also can happen with service providers or with staff within organizations, especially in the anti-trafficking community. A service provider or an advocate, they are definitely exposed to so many stories, heartbreaking stories, traumatic stories. They may not live them, but they definitely carry them around with them. And that can be difficult. So having that support within your organization or having that culture and that environment that allows you to have that conversation with your peers or with some type of peer support is especially helpful. And sometimes it's important to gauge whether or not survivor or service advocate, whether or not you need to step back. It's okay to step back sometimes. It's okay to say no. And it's okay to take a break. So when it comes to survivors in the workspace, I hear this all the time. Well, Roxie, I'm working with a survivor. I don't really know what to do, but I try my best. I have good intentions, and I really want this to be a really good working relationship. However, I mean, she's moody, or he's moody, or he's guarded. I don't get what I need when I need it, and then I ask them, and it's an argument. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. However, some service providers benefit from understanding some of the things that they can do to sustain and perpetuate a survivor inclusive environment. So some of the trauma informed practices in the workplace include respecting body space. I know that's something small, and I know that's actually universal within the workspace, but think back when you're dealing with someone who's been through a lot of trauma. Body space is really important. It goes back to autonomy, agency, and choice. Respecting body space when it comes to survivors who are working with you is a sign of respect, as it is for everyone else. Provide options, provide choices. Ask them, hey, a lot of workspaces and organizations, yes, they will have set lunch times. Yes, they will have set break times. But what if you have a survivor who may need a different set of types of breaks? What if they need, instead of two 15-minute breaks, what if they need their 15-minute breaks down in 5 minutes? Intervals throughout the day. Well, that's a conversation both the survivor, the service advocate, and or the leadership can have with that survivor. The more options, the better. There are so many ways to meet the organizational needs while working with the survivor and providing that inclusive environment. But the more choices, the better. Promote means for building self-esteem. So when you're hiring survivors, keep in mind the trauma. Going through trafficking, it wears and tears on the self-esteem. It brings about feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, meaningless. And so while a survivor may be healing through that, which is a continuous journey, keep in mind that the more you build this platform of survivor inclusion and continue to promote things that build self-esteem. For example, I know with the Human Trafficking Legal Center, we send out care packages recently. That doesn't necessarily directly connect with self-esteem, but at least it allowed us to show our survivors or the survivors that we're working with that we care. Little things go a long way, especially this year, especially during this time. Provide information up front. This is something big. A lot of the times this goes over a lot of leaders' heads or service providers or organizations who may hire survivors because they're so used to how the information flows in and out the organization. However, remember, you're working with a survivor leader who is a primary stakeholder, as well in your mission, vision, goals, and values. Providing information up front allows a survivor to choose and to have the agency to say yes or no and to communicate with what they're feeling comfortable with. Hiring a survivor leader with the ulterior motive in mind will almost always provide you with a negative outcome. Withholding information will almost always provide you a negative outcome. Be as open and honest as possible. Demonstrate a pleasant demeanor. Again, that's something small, but having a smile, actively listening. Sometimes I know this Zoom, webinars and meetings, we get all caught up and we try to listen. And sometimes it's information overload. Even when speaking with our friends and families, we talk to them. But little things like eye contact. If you're in a conversation with a survivor within the workspace and they're speaking to you, eye contact is great. It's a universal thing. It's a sign of respect. Acknowledge and validate what a survivor is saying. That's part of pushing that voice, pushing survivor voice out there and centering it within your organization. If a survivor is speaking to you within the workspace and they're giving you something like their opinion, or they're giving you insight in reference to fundraising or trafficking initiatives, then it's really, really great to actually validate that information, acknowledge it. Some people think acknowledging is shaking your head, but then it will skip right over what they said and continue their conversation or outright ignore them. Well, if you want to build a working relationship with a survivor, especially within the workspace, that is something you want to pay attention to. Because if not, what will happen is you may unintentionally trigger a survivor, and then there has to be another conversation had. I just want to check the questions really quickly just to see whether or not anyone had any questions. Okay. Moving forward. I am coming to the end of my presentations, but I wanted to put out some additional survivor support resources, as well as some additional resources that point survivor advocates and organization leaders to toolkits that will assist them in implementing a survivor inclusive webinar. Because I can talk about this all day, and this topic is really vast and has so many different ways we can go, I want to make sure I come back with another webinar so that I can focus specifically on creating a survivor inclusive culture, which will basically be a conversation had with service providers and organization leaders. And then hopefully from there, we can move forward and talk more exclusively as survivors about some of the barriers and issues that you're currently having. Feel free to email me again. So as I'm coming close to the end, I want to reach out to see whether or not you all have any questions. Let's see. Questions. Again, the question and answer box is at the bottom. I have a question about the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, I will be sending the PowerPoint presentation out on our email list. If you would like to be added to our email list, please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Sorry guys, I'm trying to multitask here. Okay, I have a question here that states, what is your advice on paying survivor consultants? My advice is pay them, period. Pay survivor consultants. Remember, survivor leaders are the key stakeholders in the anti-trafficking community. They are the subject matter experts. Just like you would pay a consultant to come in and do capacity building, your ability in the paying a survivor is what you want to do, period. Giving them small change because you feel like, oh, they're a survivor, they don't need it again. That's you defining what they need. Survivors need that type of support, just like everybody else. And so if you're engaging and you're recruiting a survivor, make sure you're paying them. The questions are pouring in. Let's see. We have another question. What can we do if we notice organizations using survivor inclusion in a way that is not really inclusive or good for the survivor leader? Great question. As a survivor or a survivor leader, the one thing that a survivor leader or survivor can do, especially working within the anti-trafficking community, these issues are bound to come up. And one thing I want to put out there is that a lot of the times it is not done purposely. A lot of the times this comes about, again, when the foundation isn't set within the organization so that they are able to authentically and intentionally respond to including survivors within their organizations. So with that being said, it's good to have those conversations, reach out to the organization. I mean, hey, everybody has their own way of reaching out, but it's beneficial both to survivor leaders, to those who are running the organization, as well as the entire community to reach out, friendly, positive, ask them questions, ask them out for Zoom coffee, the times that we're in. However, offer your advice, point them in the direction of a organization, a small organization that might be doing it correctly or that you feel they're doing correctly. Once you begin to ask questions, you might be surprised about what you're learning or what you learn. Perhaps that organization may need some assistance. If you're a survivor leader and turns out they need assistance, hey, that might be an opportunity for you to become a consultant with them. I hope that answered the question. We are a little bit over our time, almost. I want to get through all the questions. There are a lot. So let's see, the next one. You mentioned consulting as a way to include survivors in the organization's world. What does that look like? That first looks like creating the structure, as I mentioned before, within the organization so that when you are engaging with a survivor or survivor consultant, you understand how to create the best working relationship with them. Survivor consultants come at all levels. Sometimes people want capacity building, which means specific work with their strategic plan and building that foundation of survivor inclusion. Sometimes organizations want specific information regarding starting initiatives around survivor programming. Two different levels. But with that being said, then just like with other consultants within the real world, then there are things like MOUs that can be made, conversations being had, evaluations. Oh, that's one thing I didn't mention. Before you engage with survivors or survivor leaders, or even want to bring about a survivor consultant, one thing that's good for organizations to do, leaders, service advocates, service providers, and everyone else within the organization, one thing to do is evaluate your own organization. Ask questions within the organization. Have the leadership team have that hard conversation about what they have and what they don't. Because when you take tally of those things, it's easier to measure. So therefore, when you are engaging a survivor consultant, you will be able to express exactly what you need. And then the survivor leader, as a consultant, can express to you exactly what they can give you and assist you with that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. I hope that answered your question. Next question, how do you recommend asking or opening the door without asking if staff members or consultants have relevant lived experience? I'm not sure I quite understand that question. How do you recommend asking or opening the door without asking if staff members or consultants have relevant? If you're speaking about asking whether or not a consultant or staff is a survivor, I want to say allow them to give you that information. Allow them to disclose that. Because what you don't want to do is push someone into a position to disclose something that they're not ready to disclose. The best thing you can do, again, is to create that inclusive environment, create that peer support, and then if they feel comfortable, they will disclose. If not, then it's their choice. So I wouldn't really recommend asking any questions or trying to pry. I really don't have a script as to, how to ask a survivor or survivor leader if they have this experience, because 9 times out of 10, if your organization has a survivor inclusive culture, and they're supportive and they're authentically engaging survivor inclusion, then a survivor, a lot of times you will get that self-disclosure. Next question. If someone with the organization has chosen to self-identify as a survivor leader, what are good non-invasive questions to ask to ensure I, as a coworker, are making interactions safe and supportive, if any? If someone chooses to self-identify as a survivor leader, and I think I've answered this question a little bit before, is be supportive. Thank you for sharing that information. That sounds difficult. Be empathetic. I wouldn't necessarily push the organization's agenda. And sometimes this is difficult because as a survivor or a survivor leader within that organization, they may want to be helpful. They may want to incorporate their story in the organization, or within the narrative that the organization wants to put out there. But a lot of the time, sometimes you still have to consider that it could be re-traumatizing. So there's baby steps involved. So I would gauge based off what the survivor leader or the survivor is giving, and then ask them questions about how they would like to move on, and then focus on moving on forward from there. I hope that answered that question. What are your thoughts on background checks? This is the next question. When to do them and how to follow company policies, but still being able to hire survivors, especially those with criminal records. So when it comes to background checks, when survivor leaders approach smaller organizations, especially within the anti-trafficking movement, a lot of them understand that background checks can potentially lessen the chances for survivor or survivor leaders to be hired. So therefore, they don't do them. They have alternate methods of making sure that they are safe and that the environment within the organization is safe. When it comes to companies and larger organizations, you probably won't be able to get around that because they already have set policies and procedures. So I think that has to do with having a conversation with the leadership team, bringing it up as a potential deterrent from engaging or bringing survivor leaders on, and then examining the laws within your states to see what type of policies or revisions that you can make within your organizations so that you're following the law. You're also adhering to the policies and procedures that are currently there, but then making room to bring survivor leaders or incorporate them within your organization. Next question. I am a survivor and I work with a number of allies on non-survivors who tell me often that they push for survivor leaderships often makes them feel unqualified. They feel like they don't belong in the movement or they are unwanted because they are not survivors. How would you respond to an ally feeling this way and sharing this with you as a survivor? That is a deep question. And I would like to talk to you one-on-one. We should talk about that because that has a lot of things in it. And I think that again, creating a safe space for survivors, this is why it's important to create a safe space, especially now that we have a lot of talk surrounding allies or allyship, creating that diversity, equity, inclusion initiative, and then survivor inclusion. This is one of the reasons why it's really important to begin putting this at the forefront of your organizations or within the workplace. The push for survivor leadership It's understandable. I understand it, and I understand why it's happening. However, you have to remember the survivor leaders are the subject matter experts. If you're pushing further than what a survivor leader or what the survivor leaders are willing to give, then you need to re-examine why you're pushing that way. What within your organization or within your missions, values, or goals allows you to move in that way? It may not be intentional, it may be something that you have to go back and revisit. However, just keep in mind respect and boundaries. The person who asked that question, again, I'll drop my email in the box towards the end, and then you can send me an email, and hopefully we can speak further about that. You guys are on fire with these questions. Okay. Next question. What are your thoughts on background checks? I think we talked about that. When to do them and how to follow company policies, but still, yeah, we answered that question. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the next one. Are there communities of survivors who can provide the peer support that you have mentioned? Yes, Survivor Alliance. Survivor Alliance, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a survivor-led organization that not only provides a platform or support for survivors, however, they can point service providers or organizations in the right directions of building survivor-inclusive companies or cultures, as well as pointing them in towards other survivor-led organizations that can assist with providing that peer support. You also can look at organizations like Freedom Network. That's another organization that works really hard with survivor inclusion or including survivors and does a really outstanding job with that. So you may want to reach out to them. There are countless other organizations, but again, if you would like more information, please reach out to me. I'll definitely give you that information. Oh, one more organization I should mention. The National Survivor Alliance is another organization that's survivor-led and has a lot of additional resources that both survivors and service providers and organizational leaders can benefit from. Next question. Is it helpful to have a survivor engagement policy for a government-based task force? I'm so glad you asked that question. Of course, it's helpful for that to happen. So because creating a survivor engagement policy, especially within a government-based task force, presents the platform and the foundation and the guidelines that organizations can then look forward to or look towards to assist them in then adapting that type of policies and procedures that would allow them to not only follow the law, but create the space for survivor inclusion. That's some of the prime things that are missing from government-based task force. But as our work continues, and when I say our work, I mean within the anti-trafficking community, especially on task force around the country and around the world, hopefully these policies will not only be considered, but be implemented. But know that these take time. And one of the ways that you can engage with this is looking into joining one of the human trafficking task force or joining a government-based task force, and then starting the conversation yourself, pushing for it yourself, asking the questions about why they aren't there. And sometimes you'll get the answer that you're looking for. Sometimes there isn't an answer. But given where we are politically, hopefully we'll begin to move forward in creating such policies to help guide organizations. We are hoping on time. We got about 10 more minutes. I want to leave a little space to put my information at the bottom. We have 3 more questions. Before I go into the rest of the questions, I just wanted to make you all aware that I'm reading the questions as anonymous to protect confidentiality. I don't want to use names, especially because this is recorded. So please don't take offense if I don't call your name or give you a shout out. I do acknowledge you. And if you do have additional questions, please reach out to me by email. Moving on to the next question. Hi. Hi. Will you be sending this PowerPoint? Yes, I will be sending the PowerPoint. Again, I'll be sending it through our listserv, in which you can also subscribe to. It's called the Human Trafficking Legal Center Survivor and Advocate Mailing List, Survivor and Advocate Mailing Resource List. Again, if you want to be part of that mailing list, well, where you will receive additional updates on our forthcoming events, including this webinar series, along with other events that we have, or additional resources for both service providers, advocates, as well as survivors, then this is a great list to be a part of. Here's the next question, second to last one. We feel committed to hiring survivors. How do we do this inclusively, respectively, without asking for disclosure? You first want to consider your audience. If you really want to hire survivors, you can, there's a way you can do this without asking for survivors to disclose. Again, if you're providing that foundation where you're authentically creating that survivor inclusive environment, then you will be able to attract, onboard, and sustain survivors. Without asking for disclosure. There are other ways that you can get into contact or increase your engagement with survivors by or through other survivor-led organizations. Reach out to them, give them a little bit of information about your organization, what you do, what you're hoping to do when it comes to survivor and inclusion. And you can ask them, it's appropriate to ask survivor-led organizations, or provide them with employment opportunities that you have for survivors. That way, once the foundation within your organization is built or it's being built, you not only have that relationship, or you've not only started that relationship building process with a survivor-led organization, but they can continuously give you information or more education about how to continually and consistently implement survivor inclusive initiatives and environments. Remember, a survivor doesn't need to disclose to work within your workspace. Survivors can work on all different roles, human resources. Sometimes survivors can be part of your board. That's a great thing, especially because that's where most of the decisions are being made or passed down to the leadership. Advisory councils or committees, human resources. Survivors are more than their story. Survivor leaders also have skill sets that they actively want to use and they're eager to bring to your organization. Almost there, guys, at the end of the questions. Are there any good tools or references in how to see if your organization is survivor informed and how to get it there? Yes, so I listed this at the end of my organization. There are multiple toolkits with the hyperlink provided where you as a service provider or someone on a leadership team within an organization, company, or small business can look into and use this toolkit to begin formulating this environment. These toolkits come with things like evaluations, like evaluating your organizational culture, evaluating your programs, your current initiatives to see what you actually already have or that's already built in within your organizations, and what you can be doing to bring in more so this inclusive environment. Evaluation is really important because that will assist in leading your metrics and further evaluation. It will assist you with measuring the goals that you have with survivor inclusion or your initiative that you want to implement. And then one thing that it will also assist you with doing is if you ever come into an issue, and things are bound to come up when it comes to capacity building, organizational change, or implementing new ideas within organizations. If you come into an issue, then using this toolkit and then gathering your information and your data and actually, connecting that data with your strategic plan and your mission, then you will be able to almost predict some of the problems that you will come into contact. You can't predict every problem. And if there's a problem that does come up that you want to address, it's great to reach out to survivor-led organizations and they can guide you. You can even reach out to the survivor that you may have on your team and listen to their input. It may not be, it may not be what you exactly want to hear, but know this, you hire them for a reason and understand that the insight that they're giving you is valuable. Okay, guys, we have about 6 minutes and I don't want to cut this off before time. So I'm going to answer these last two questions. And then again, I'll put my information at the bottom and I'll send out the PowerPoint presentation so that you guys can reach out to me and we can continue this conversation. But don't worry, there's more to come. We will definitely have another webinar where we can continue to talk about these issues, both on the survivor leader side as well as the organizational leader as well in advocate side. And hopefully, instead of having a webinar where I'm just talking at you guys through a screen, we can turn this more so into a discussion and we can have a conversation to exchange ideas. So I'll go back to the questions. Can you please discuss racism in the anti-trafficking movement? How does this impact survivors? Whew. That is an entire webinar on its own. But to give you a short answer, as we know, 2020 was one challenging year. Not only did we have one pandemic, which was COVID, which is still going on, we also had the racial pandemic that quickly followed afterward, or shall I say, was enhanced by the COVID pandemic. And this not only showed, when you look at both the COVID pandemic as well as the racism pandemic, it not only showed the disparities within health, it showed or highlighted the disparities between racial inequity within our community as well as within the workplace. It just blew everything up. So we all know what came after that. A lot of organizations put out statements and, stated they wanted to start these new initiatives, started consulting with or, collaborating with DEI consultants and things like that to see what more they can do to create a more conducive environment. But when it comes to the impact on survivors, again, it's about building that infrastructure within the organization. If your organization did not have that before, and a lot of organizations didn't, because quite honestly and quite frankly, it wasn't something that was important. It wasn't put there so that it wasn't important. Organizations are, they have plans, they have goals and missions. But when this hit the fan, it became important. Therefore, a lot of organizations began to look more closely about how racism is impacting survivors. They began expanding their conversations with the survivors within their organizations, but also with their stakeholders on an external basis with the survivor-led organizations or advocacy organizations outside of their organizations. We saw so many different partnerships come about because of this. And then we also, and I'm sure everybody here has participated in at least one webinar about racism within the anti-trafficking movement. So again, this is an entirely different webinar, and I would love to speak to whoever answered this question. They ask it anonymously. Please email and reach out to me and we can continue this conversation and see how we can bring this up as another webinar, because I think this is something that we should continue to talk about and continue to bring about new and different ideas. And I want to hear some of the things that from both survivors as well as advocates as well as leadership. I would like to hear some of the current issues that you're still having. And maybe we can talk about solutions and how to move forward. Last question. How can you respond to the organizations who interview you for a job and guarantee you they aren't looking for I'm not sure what this is, but then turn your back? If a heart wrench, especially after spending more time than I would give them. I wish I could answer this question, but unfortunately I'm not able to. I don't quite understand the question. So one second, everyone. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to go ahead and try to put my information on here. Let's see. Okay, I'm putting my email address. And you also have this email address. It was sent to you after you registered for the webinar. So if you don't get it here, then you'll definitely are able to go back to your confirmation and access my email address. And please reach out. I also want to send more information about the Human Trafficking Legal Center and the resources that we provide to survivors as well as legal professionals who would like to work with survivors. So if you have any questions, if you're a legal professional who would like to connect with the Human Trafficking Legal Center, please reach out to me or any of one of my colleagues or Martina Vandenberg, the president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. I will also send out additional information about our partner, Survivor Alliance. If you are a survivor that has attended or who is currently attending this webinar, I would like to send you some membership information if you're interested in becoming a member with them. And to service providers, if you would like to share that to any survivors that you know or any organizations working with survivors, it would be greatly appreciated. It is now 2 o'clock. Without further ado, I want to thank everybody for participating and attending in this webinar. I look forward to bringing you part 2 of this webinar because from the questions, you guys are really excited and it seems like we have a lot to talk about, and I'm so excited to dive right in and to bring you additional co-panelists who can assist in bringing more education, awareness, information, and resources directly to you. Thank you so much for attending. Again, my name is Roxie Farrow, and I wish you well. Have a great day.